Now I'm very excited to be handing off to Bob, and I will see you again for the Q&A.
I really appreciate you taking the time to participate in this presentation. I'm very excited to show you some of the work our team at Framestore created for Rebel Moon. So how did I end up here giving a presentation about visual effects? Here's my super brief story. In high school, I fell in love with coding and specifically using code to generate computer graphics. I went to college and studied information systems. During my time in college, I also completed 4 short films in the Sight and Sound workshop at NYU. That is when I fell in love with visual storytelling. Now, after I graduated from college, I headed to Los Angeles and began my career in visual effects. And as you can see at the bottom of this slide, I've been credited in a variety of roles over my career. I've been working in visual effects for over 20 years, and these are the projects I've worked on. And one of the things I really enjoy about working in visual effects is that every project I've ever worked on brings with it a unique set of technical and creative challenges. At the start of a project, one of my responsibilities in my role as visual effects supervisor is to immerse myself in the material that describes the creative direction of the project. Those can be things like the script, the artwork, storyboards, reference material. During that process, I try to generate a list of what I think will be the unique set of creative and technical challenges for that project. This helps me begin a dialogue with my crew so we can start to establish areas we want to focus on for our development efforts. I could probably do an entire presentation on that process, but if there is one key aspect of the process that I think everyone can apply to their own work in VFX, is to prioritize the things that will improve the realism of what ends up on the screen. In preparation for this presentation, I looked back at the list I made for Rebel Moon and selected 4 items that I thought did improve the quality and realism of our work. I'll start by giving you an overview of our lensing workflow. Then I'll discuss a technique we use to integrate layers of atmosphere into our plates. I'm going to follow that with 2 examples of how we combined green screen elements with creature animation. And lastly, I'll present a variety of challenges that came in the development of our 2 alien creatures. I'll break it up with some behind the scenes and shot breakdown reels as well. I tried to find a balance for this presentation and presenting these topics. However, I'm sure some people will find this too technical and others not technical enough. So please utilize the chat to ask questions if you need further clarification. And ultimately, my hope is that you can walk away from this presentation and apply some aspect of these techniques to your own work, or at least give you a different perspective on how you might tackle a problem you're trying to solve. And if I don't succeed in either of those endeavors, you'll hopefully enjoy watching some behind the scenes videos from this sci-fi movie. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the scope of work we delivered at Framestore. Our crew worked on Rebel Moon for 2 years. During the first 6 months, we focused on the prep that was needed for the shoot. In particular, we created rigs and began animation testing for the 2 main CG creatures. This early development was necessary to inform methodologies for the physical shoot. Over the next 12 months, we were busy with shot production. This encompassed our main work on the film, visual effects work on the film. We from shot turnover to final shot delivery. For Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire, our team at Framestore delivered 650 shots. It was a multi-site effort at Framestore. We had a great crew in Vancouver, led by visual effects supervisor Brian Litzen, and an equally fantastic crew of compositors at our Mumbai facility, led by Sanjoy Biswas. Framestore did have the largest portion of work on Part 1. However, there were multiple vendors on the project. So as you see the reels, you'll be able to see what sequences we worked on at Framestore. If a scene from the film was not on one of the reels, we probably didn't work on it. For the final 6 months, we delivered 50 shots for Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, and we delivered an additional 250 shots for the R-rated cuts of both Part 1 and Part 2. So in the end, we delivered approximately 1,000 shots for the project. I'm going to play the first reel, and this should give you some visual context for the scope of our work. So, in addition to directing the films, Zack Snyder was also the director of photography. The core set of lenses in his package were anamorphic lenses he had built for the movie by Zero Optics. They were custom-built lenses that used anamorphic elements from vintage glass made by the Shiga company in the 70s. These lenses had every optical artifact contribute to their distinct look. And this distinct look is what Zack loved about these lenses. So we needed to be able to reproduce the artifacts in post so our visual effects shots would look like the rest of the film. Deconstructing all the attributes that contribute to the lensing can be a daunting task. So we broke the process into multiple steps. We already have robust tools and proven workflows to handle a few of the steps. The first being lens distortion, as we commonly call it. It is the change in the magnification of the image across the field of view. In this example, the magnification of the image increases as it moves away from the center of the image. That's why the straight lines start to bow towards the edges. Most CG workflows, including ours at Framestore, require the image to be flattened or undistorted. In this process, the inverse distortion is applied to the image so that the objects in the image will align with the real world objects in the set. You can see how extreme the distortion was on the widest anamorphic lens in the package, which was a 24 millimeter. Second step was to profile the vignette for each lens. So this is the change in brightness of the image across the field of view. And each lens had its own vignette pattern. The third step was to use our existing tools to recreate the flares caused by light passing through the iris and reflecting in the lens. The stereotypical horizontal anamorphic flare falls into this category. These lenses produced a multitude of other subtle and not so subtle artifacts in addition to those, the three I just covered. And to add to that complexity, there was variation between the lenses. You can see that variance in this image. These stills come from elements of the same lamp shot with each anamorphic lens in the package. From our experience working with Zack Snyder on Army of the Dead, which was also shot with vintage lens elements, we wanted to find a more efficient way of profiling these variations. We were fortunate that we were also collaborating again with production VFX supervisor Marcus Taramina from Army of the Dead. And Marcus was also very keen to improve the lens profiling process for this film. So Marcus had a board fabricated with a grid of LEDs that was really a key input to our profiling process. We've dubbed it the bokeh board. On Army of the Dead, we recreated a similar grid in post by evaluating lots of footage from each lens. That was both very time-consuming and very subjective. The grid of LEDs in these elements gave us the ability to quickly and accurately profile the different regions of each lens. For the profiling process, we took the approach of treating each lens like we would a digital asset we needed to build for the project. For example, if we needed to build a CG version of a prop that was used in the physical production, we would scan the object, shoot texture photos. In post, we would model, we would have a modeler model it, a textured painter texture it, and a look dever create the final look. So we applied the same concept to scheduling a dev task for each lens as if it was its own unique build. In the prop example I just gave you, we would typically have reference photos of the actual object we could use to compare side by side with our CG prop to verify that it matched the real world, its real world counterpart. We needed a similar comparison for each lens profile. We had the bokeh boards to match, but we still needed a ground truth for the other subtle and not so subtle artifacts we were seeing. We decided to use the lens grid elements as our target for the side-by-side comparison. To represent our CG renders, we used the original Photoshop generated image of the grid that you see here. This is the image that was printed, attached to a board, and used to photograph the lens elements, the lens grid elements we were going to compare to. Just like our CG renders, it is numerically perfect and lacks any of the characteristics of the optical system. In short, it looks very CG. After applying our profiles to the Photoshop image of the grid, we compared them side by side with the lens grid elements, and here are the results of our work. The images on the left are the native lens grid scans for the given lenses. On the right are the Photoshop image with our lens profiles applied. Here's some of the wider focal lengths. So they're not perfect matches, but I think we got pretty close. The one modification we did make was changing the white balance so that we could match the tone of the image. Our ultimate goal was to match the look of the photography of the plates. We wanted the audience to see a seamless shot where they couldn't distinguish what elements of the shot were CG and what elements were photographed. Here's another example of lensing applied to the CG sword elements in a shot. So looking back on the project, I can say that taking the time to profile the lenses like we did really benefited us. We were able to minimize the subjectivity for the compositors. We have a great compositing team, but like any project with a volume of shots, with a large volume of shots, it's extremely helpful to have a process that gets a compositor 90% of the look out of the box. In this case, since our movie was shot with a lens package that consisted of lenses that all had very different looks, it was well worth the time we spent profiling them. The final battle at Gondoval was a big portion of our work for part one. The script location for the sequence was an aerial depot for spaceships. The plates were shot on a soundstage, and for the final shots, they wanted it to look like the location was exposed to the elements. That meant we would need a lot of dynamic atmosphere traveling through the plate to fully immerse the scene into the location. I'm going to show you another reel that shows our work on Gondoval. Our typical workflow is to render atmosphere volumes on separate layers. For example, we would render a foreground, midground, background layers. Then we'd use our keys or rotos to layer them into the shot. So why didn't we stick with this workflow? One of the main reasons was that the camera coverage was due to the camera coverage in the scene. There were a lot of different angles in the sequence. So depending on the camera position, the atmosphere could be moving left to right or back to front or front to back. This made it difficult to establish a consistent strategy for rendering our atmosphere in layers. We also had a large number of shots that needed atmosphere, approximately 400. So it made sense for us to look around at other methods that could give us a more standardized workflow and produce better looking shots. So instead of rendering many layers of atmosphere in the area of the physical set, could we just render one atmosphere pass? And if we did render it as a single pass, how do we layer our 3D atmosphere into the 2D image? Even the most precise body tracking will never be accurate enough to give you pixel accurate edges in your deep holdouts or your holdouts. And the cost alone would be impractical. So instead, we combined rough tracks of the objects in the shot and our final roto splines or keys. The roto gave us the accurate profile of the object, and the rough track provided the proper depth for the projection of the roto. I really dislike the term 2.5D, but I have to admit, this technique is the epitome of a 2.5D process. Here's an example. And here's another example of the atmosphere element over black, so you can clearly see the holdout shapes. So, would we do it again? My answer is probably. We found out that the number of roto layers was not consistent shot to shot. In some shots, we might need 3 layers of roto. In other shots, we need 7 layers. It really depended on the composition of the plate photography and how many objects were in it. So in a way, it became a trade-off. We reduced the amount of atmosphere layers, but increased the amount of roto layers we needed to manage per shot. Another thing to consider in this process is that inherently it will be less accurate as the objects get closer to camera. There's also a lot of prep required to use this technique. And that's in the form of object tracks and roto. Moving forward, I think this is one area where machine learning will make this process more efficient. Some of the auto roto tools and auto tracking tools are already pretty robust. So it's something we're going to continue to evaluate. Because ultimately, even though it was still a pretty complex process, I think in the end, it gave us nicer looking shots. The third topic I'm going to discuss is how we approach the interaction between the CG characters and the actors. I'm going to play this reel that features our flying creature called the Bennu. I'm sure, as many of you know, reanimating green screen elements of actors in cases like this aerial sequence can go sideways really quickly. The flying scene in part one was not prevised. Zack boarded the sequence as he wanted to give the actor some flexibility with the performance. So in prep, we worked with Marcus Termina to work through the methodology for the shoot. The goal of the setup was to prioritize capturing two things. First, the relative operation of the camera to the actor. And second, use the roll of the flying rig to establish when the creature would bank and turn. The rest, we were confident we could control in post. We have tools that allow us to anchor a plate element to a CG character. Our animators can then establish the flight path. They can control the distance of the subjects to the camera, and they can add high frequency movement. And they can do this all while visualizing it in their viewer in Maya. Our tools are designed to align the optical center of the actor's plate and the optical center of the virtual camera that renders the scene. The simpler way to say that is we try to maintain the original perspective of the green screen element. This next reel I'm going to show is features our spider alien, Harmada. And she posed a different set of challenges, and we'll discuss those after the reel. Harmada's body needed to be an extension of the actor. So we had to have a very accurate tracking rig for Jenna Malone in makeup effects to give us a tight track of her performance in the plate. Our rigging team created a really nice setup for animation to layer in the animation of the body extension while preserving the integrity of the actor's body track. We had a really high success rate for using the plate photography for these creatures. There were only a few instances that required a character to be replaced with a CG character or part of a CG character. For Harmada, it was when she had to perform beyond the limits of what could be done in camera. I think when you have shots with complex creature interaction and actors on the physical set, you need to plan for some of your assumptions to be wrong. Even if you previs or tech-viz the hell out of the sequence, there's always a chance you'll need to make modifications to your methodologies once you put it all together. For Harmada, it wasn't until we were in post that we determined we needed to adjust our methodology. And I'll tell you about that a little bit more in the section I'm going to start right now. So in this last section, I'm going to focus on some of the development challenges we faced while creating our two main alien creatures. It'll be a medley of creature topics that I thought might be interesting to hear about. I'm going to start with talking about performance. With both creatures, we started with an approved design, and as a first step, we needed to understand what kind of performance was needed. For Harmada, her only scene required her to fight. And the design of her character is very unique. It's essentially a biped attached to the body that has 8 legs and 2 pincers. During early animation testing, we found the design made it difficult to achieve strong fighting poses. And we needed to make an adjustment to the original methodology that we established with Marcus. In that original methodology, our strategy was to use the actor's torso down to the hips. Our reasoning was that the hips are the most predictable and least dynamic spot to make the transition to the CG body. However, we found we could not achieve poses like the one in this image if we used the actor's hips. So we modified the methodology by including the hips in the CG body extension. That gave us much more control to find these strong poses for the body while still maintaining the alignment with the actor's plate. In doing this, we moved our split of the plate to the CG body higher so that it was just below the chest, basically at the base of the rib cage for most of the shots. For the flying creature, which was called the Bennu, we looked at lions and raptors for inspiration. The performance was to use the strength of both creatures. So it needed to be a powerful aviator and a powerful land predator. When the concept for the Bennu character was turned over to us, Marcus emphasized that Zack really wanted the creature to look powerful and intimidating. The Bennu would require a lot of muscle mass. Notice the volume of muscle in the neck. That is not typical of a bird. It's much more like a horse or a giraffe. It made the Bennu very front heavy. So we needed to position the wings as far forward on the body as we could in order to make the creature look like it could fly. This led to the next challenge, figuring out how to deal with the convergence of the front legs and the wings. Other designs of griffin-like creatures have the wing placed further back on the torso. We now know why. It's because it's much easier to rig when the shoulder and the wing joints are separated by some distance. I have to give credit to our rigging team. They did an amazing job figuring out the mechanics of that part of the anatomy. And by keeping the wing forward, we were able to give Zack the muscle mass he was looking for and still maintain that really nice stereotypical scapula movement you see when a cat puts weight on their front legs. One aspect of this character we struggled with in rigging was understanding how the skin on the wing deforms relative to the articulation of the skeleton. I'm showing you these images so you can get a glimpse at the type of research that goes into solving these kinds of problems. Using these X-rays of an eagle wing, we were able to, our riggers were able to model the wing mechanics for the Bennu after this example from the physical world. We are often referencing the physical world to find answers, to find the answers we need to make our virtual creatures look more realistic. Because the Bennu creature was so large, it was susceptible to suffering from stuffed animal syndrome. That's when you cover a creature in the same uniform coat of fur that looks like it was manufactured by a machine. To overcome this, there needs to be an order to the frequency of detail. The lowest frequency detail is the overall form of the character and the shape and proportions. And then, which I think is the most important, you need to establish a second frequency of detail. This image clearly shows that secondary frequency. The feathers were broken into sections that complemented the overall form of the creature while creating regions of variation. Another way we reinforced the secondary frequency of detail was with color and patterns. Our look dev team created a shading model for what we called oily incandescence. That was the key layer that enabled us to match the complexity of what we were seeing in nature. The last frequency of detail are the fine details. I tried really hard to get through this presentation without using the words organic or gritty. But using this technique will make your creatures look more organic, and adding fine details and blemishes will help you match the gritty look we see in nature. And that concludes my list of topics. I hope you can relate to some of our challenges, and I'll try to answer any questions you might have. But before, I'd like to say it was really great to collaborate with Zack Snyder and Marcus Terramina again on Rebel Moon. As someone who loves creating unique compositions, dynamic action, and powerful visuals, working with Zack is a dream. And Marcus embraced us as collaborators on the project and made it a fantastic creative experience. And lastly, I want to thank my crew at Framestore for all of the talent, skill, and hard work they put into the project. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bob. That was a very fascinating group of things that you spoke about there. So thank you so much for going through that all with us. And we've got a few minutes for some questions for you. So let's start off with, so obviously you've gone through in Rebel Moon talking about a multitude of visual effects that were created for the film. I mean, literally every type of visual effects imaginable was in there. We saw quite a lot in your presentation today. So you've mentioned some of the challenges as well, but what proved to be the most challenging when you think back on the years you spent on these projects?
Sure. I definitely, I focused a lot on the creatures in this presentation because they are, there's a complexity to these creatures that just inherently make them the most challenging, because they really do have to satisfy a lot of things. They have a lot of responsibility. Not only do the mechanics need to look realistic, right? And all the effort needs to go into that, but the performance is essential, right, to the storytelling. So you have to combine those two things, which are always quite difficult. And then on top of that, they were also interacting with, or in the case of Harmada, being an extension of the actor with the physical production and the physical set. So you have that added complexity of making sure that you're able to get, you know, the action correct so that our CG can help complement that. So I think those are definitely the most complex in terms of how much responsibility they have, right, in the movie as a visual effect. And then secondly, I'd say it's probably the Gondoval scene kind of as a whole, because it was, as I was saying, 400 shots. It required, um, you know, a lot of volumetrics, a lot of layering issues, like I touched on, but also a bunch of stuff I didn't touch on, which is a huge effort by our environment team to make that complex environment. And then a huge effort by our effects team to do the destruction, the, the energy blasters, all that kind of stuff. There's just tons and tons of layers of elements that we generated for that sequence.
It's amazing to see before and afters, and we don't often get to see them. So it's kind of a treat to be able to look behind the scenes in that way and actually see how much is being built that's not then visible when you put everything, all the layering, all the atmosphere you talked about. And when you see the building of it, you see the city really goes far off the distance. There's all this detail happening, and then you put all the layering in, and there's just so much more scope in there that we appreciate when we see the behind the scenes. So there's a tremendous amount of work done by the
Yeah,
team
appreciate it. Yeah,
Can you
we get a little too used to it when we're deep in it, right? We kind of don't have that perspective all the time until we are finished and there's some time to look back and reflect on it.
you spoke about the characters, and one thing that Framestore is known for is its incredible creature work. How do the artists bring out the emotional performances for these characters and creatures?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think we do it as well as anyone, right? At Framestore in terms of identifying what aspect of the performance is going to give us the biggest payoff and really, allow us to connect with the character or with the action that's happening in the scene. And I think that's the key. So, I think we have a fantastic set of technical tools to get the mechanics of these creatures, regardless of whether they're based on some realistic, creature or made up, as in the case we had for our main creatures in this film. We have a really good foundation of the technical so that we can focus on the things, the performance, and really, hone in on what it is, what's important about the shot, and able to deliver that with our fantastic animation team.
Can you give us a bit of insight into what your role on set looks like and what kind of problems that you're looking to solve while on set?
Um, again, I think a lot of our focus when I was on set working with Marcus was the creatures. And I had that one slide in there about I made the comment about, assume that some of your, assumptions are going to be wrong, even if you spend a ton of time doing prep and pre-visiting, tech visiting, all that kind of stuff. So I think, there's a lot of value to kind of understanding on the day, seeing it happen, seeing the action, and understanding how that's going to fit and how that's going to translate into post, into what we do. Um, because there is a lot of nuance shot to shot. So I think it's really important to be part of that and work with the team to make sure we have what we need to be able to solve anything, really any kind of dynamic situation or dynamic performance that's going to come our way in post. So yeah.
Someone's asked, with the rise of real-time rendering for previs or blocking, you just mentioned previs, do you guys consider using that method? Did you consider using that method while working on this? So
Um,
real-time rendering and then previs or blocking, which you did mention previs.
yeah, so I guess there are three different categories there. In terms of the real-time rendering, We specifically didn't. I think the timeline with this project when it started, we were introducing some real time for previs work and things like that. So we were kind of a generation before utilizing the tools, the real-time tools that we currently have. In terms of previs, there was some previs done, particularly for the flying scene. Actually, we actually focus more on post-viz, which was, really trying to bring it to life and understanding the mechanics of the shots and the relationship between the actor and the creature. So we spent a lot of time on post-viz. And then the blocking, yeah, specifically the animation blocking, we spent a lot of time on that. I would say that we probably spend more time on blocking than sometimes we do our primary animation. And in the end, they're both things are contributing to the final look of the performance. But we really spend a lot of time in blocking, making sure we have a sound foundation for the performance and something that's gonna, when we do add those secondaries and refine it, that we have something that is mechanically sound and going to provide us with a realistic result.
Sorry, this leads nicely to another question, which is set related as well. Someone wrote, "Thank you for this very informative webinar. I'm just starting my journey with visual effects, specifically interested in producing, and I'm wondering what kinds of conversations are happening with the production crew when planning visual effects scenes on set."
Well, I think it's filmmaking's a collaborative process, right? There's a lot of different disciplines that need to come together to choreograph, the action and the storytelling that's unfolding in front of the camera. So I think understanding all aspects of filmmaking is crucial, because you do need to understand how other departments' decisions are going to impact yours. And you really need to be able to, weigh those things and be able to communicate with them and understand what their parameters are. So I think the more you can kind of understand filmmaking as a whole, the more valuable that'll be in terms of making effective decisions on set.
That's right. Someone's asked, what program do we use for environments?
Well, we officially have transitioned over to Houdini as our main software to support our environment tools. So we used to use Maya, but we've moved our pipeline over to Houdini to take advantage of kind of a richer procedural tool set, and to align it actually works with what we're doing as a whole in terms of using that to manage our 3D scenes.
And we also have a question here that talks about both films, asking how challenging was it to manage the visual effects pipeline for making essentially twin double features?
Well, we definitely 90% of our work was in part one. So we absolutely are, that first delivery of delivering part one was our biggest body of work. But it was it definitely it definitely raises some questions. I mean, even thinking about from a basic kind of shot management approach is, do we create two different movies within our folder structure, or do we do it all under one? We decided to do it under one. But yeah, there's all sorts of those kind of questions that come up because you want to be able to, track things and handle things as if they are two different films. So there was definitely more overhead on the production side. I would say that they took more the burden of that than anyone else, because there was more complexity to tracking and managing, the assets and the shots and the production workflow.
think we have time for one more question, so we can squeeze one more in. What is your favorite piece of advice to give to aspiring visual effects supervisors?
It's important to always want to have a desire to learn. I think as people kind of move up through their career, and if they work within visual effects in a certain discipline and they aspire to be a visual effects supervisor, I think you have to understand that, becoming a visual effects supervisor, you never really stop learning, right? And it's one of the things I really like about it, but you need an openness to trying new things, to learning, to changing with our dynamic industry. And I think that's an important characteristic.
Well, thank you, Bob, for your insights and your advice and all of the wonderful behind the scenes looks that you've given us today. Really appreciate your time. And,
There's no
this will
problem.
be out.
I love talking about visual effects. So it's always a pleasure.
That's it for now. Thank you so much, Bob.
I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. Take care.